Sharon Stanley be on View from Brazil, Rethinking Racial Integration in the United States.
Hi, everyone. You might imagine I'm kind of nervous because I've never spoken at a math conference before. And I'm hoping this is the only time I speak about it. But what I told myself is that this will definitely be the best political theory talk of the whole conference. So I'm pretty confident about that. And I thought that I would begin with two little anecdotes from my childhood that might actually help to explain a little bit about why I'm not a mathematician. And then I will get to the actual talk. I'm just going to make sure that it's, yeah, okay. All right, so the first anecdote is from when I was in second grade. I was around 7 years old. And someone told me that my father was a, quote, famous mathematician. And I got really excited because I had a famous father. And to me, you know, I associated fame with rock stars and movie stars. And so I started telling my friends at school, my dad is Richard Stanley. Nobody ever responded or anything. Should be excited about that. So I got kind of disappointed. I also noticed that when we went out in public, like there were no screaming teenage boys following him around in the grocery store. And so I started to wonder if he really was famous. And somehow at 7, I concluded that, well, maybe famous mathematicians aren't famous in the same way as rock stars, but probably he's famous like within the world of math, which seems reasonable. So I checked my little second grade math like little workbook, thinking that I would find his picture somewhere in it. And I didn't, and I was really disappointed and concluded either my dad wasn't famous or it just wasn't really worth being a famous mathematician. But I can now see from all the people here that actually he is famous. So I wish I had known that like 40 years ago. So that's the first anecdote. And then the second anecdote is actually sort of about math. And might help explain further why I'm not a mathematician. So I don't remember quite how old I was at this point, somewhere around maybe 8 or 9. And my dad, I guess, was trying to explain the concept of a mathematical limit to me in a way that I would find like interesting and surprising. And he told me that in our little hallway, like right in front of our front door to our house, that if I tried to walk across the whole hallway, but took like each step was half the distance of the previous step, then I would never get to the other side. And that blew my mind at 8 years old or 9 years old or however old I was. And I was determined to like test this theory. You know, I don't know if my dad remembers this, but there was like a period of like a week or two when you could probably find me in the hallway like teeny tiny steps, and realizing that it was just not possible to test the theory, that I couldn't get my steps small enough, or that I would like actually arrive at the other end of the hallway because I couldn't get my steps small enough. And again, I concluded that like math was a complete waste of time. I apologize, but I think I have somewhat improved in my mathematical understanding since then, but not enough to dissuade me from becoming a political theorist. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And I spent a lot of time thinking about what I should talk about at a math conference and how I should present my work to a group of mathematicians. And ultimately, I decided that I would talk about my, sorry, I'm not used to using these. We just like press the buttons on the computer. Okay, so I decided that I would talk about my 2017 book, An Impossible Dream, Racial Integration in the United States. But I would do so from the perspective of some work that I've done since then. So in roughly from 2018 to 2022, I wrote a series of articles about racial politics in Brazil. And I traveled there a couple of times before the pandemic as well. And the work I did in Brazil on race sort of made me think back to this book that I'd written about integration in the United States and think differently about it. So today I'm going to sort of talk about how that work made me reflect on the concept of racial integration in the United States and what we might learn here in the US from racial politics in Brazil. Definitely, I'm sure the strangest talk anyone has given at a math conference, but hopefully it will be interesting. So when I first conceived this book, the idea was to give a theoretical account of what racial integration ought to mean. I had at the time been reading a lot of literature that was critical of the ideal of integration from a variety of perspectives: Black nationalism, separatism, the much maligned but little understood critical race theory, and also just ordinary sort of liberal multiculturalism. And I felt when I was reading these critiques that they weren't based on very charitable interpretations of what integration might actually mean. And in fact, the more that I read about integration, the more I was convinced that the critics of integration and the defenders of integration were basically just talking past each other because they weren't really talking about the same thing. So I wanted to show at this time that it was possible to theorize integration in such a way that it was compatible with other important political ideals: freedom, equality, democracy, justice, etc. Ultimately, I thought that if I could vindicate integration as an ideal, then if I could present a version of integration that was not vulnerable to the standard critiques, then I would be able to vindicate racial integration as an ideal. That was the original goal. But as I started to research the topic more, I found myself increasingly dissatisfied with my own approach. In particular, I started to see that I was really missing the point of the critique of integration. So the question was not whether we could paint a beautiful picture of integration on an empty canvas, right? The question is whether we could sort of create that beautiful picture of integration on the canvas that we already inhabit, right? With all of the wounds and scars of our particular racial history. And once you pose the question that way, it raises a number of additional, very difficult to answer questions. In particular, what kind of sacrifices would be necessary from citizens, especially Black citizens who bore the brunt of the regime of segregation previously? What kind of sacrifices would be necessary to bring about this particular vision of racial integration? And could we demand those sacrifices in the name of a future integration that has not yet arrived? Ultimately, I think that those are really difficult questions to answer. In fact, I don't think they really have a definitive answer. And that's essentially what the book ultimately argues. So once I started to explore these questions, the book took a more pessimistic turn. In particular, I became increasingly critical of Elizabeth Anderson's argument in her 2010 book called The Imperative of Integration. She argues in this book that racial integration is an imperative of justice, and we are all therefore obligated to pursue it. She sees strong forms of racial solidarity, strong forms of racial identity, particularly in the Black community, as obstacles to integration. She calls on scholars and activists to prioritize a shared national identity. We are all Americans, something to that effect, over and above narrower racialized group solidarities. She writes, "Neither justice nor democracy can be realized if the self-segregated racial group is celebrated as a more worthy site of identity and emotional investment than the integrated us." So in contrast, in my book, I argue that there is really no obligation on Black Americans to pursue integration. Rather, my claim is that Black integration pessimism is a defensible and reasonable position. It's not an obligatory position, but it's defensible and reasonable. And this is because any worthwhile project of integration ultimately requires a dramatic transformation of enduring racial hierarchy. And we don't yet have evidence that that transformation is really happening or is imminent, is about to happen. Specifically, despite significant and very real transformations, whiteness has always signified and continues to signify greater political, economic, and social power in the United States, and really around much of the world. In other words, racial hierarchy still exists, though it is no longer legally enshrined. Unless integration is coupled with genuine steps to dismantle that hierarchy, it won't achieve justice and democracy. And even more than that, it might in some ways actually thwart justice and democracy. And that's kind of the lesson that I've drawn from some of my studies in Brazil. So having spent several years studying racial politics in Brazil, I would make that point even more forcefully. I would say that this pursuit of an integrated us that Elizabeth Anderson advocates, without a primary commitment to dismantling racial hierarchy, threatens to create a false veneer of what's called racial democracy in Brazil. I'm going to talk a lot about that term momentarily. So if we pursue integrated us, if we pursue mixture, if we pursue integration without trying to dismantle sort of socioeconomic forms of hierarchy and political forms of hierarchy, then that will actually impede the achievement of genuine racial justice. I want to emphasize this is not a rejection of integration per se. I'm not against racial integration. Rather, I'm rejecting a particularly weak model of integration that all too often dominates popular accounts in the US, and I think throughout the Americas as well. So I want to briefly trace what that weak model of integration is, and then I'll talk a bit about why Brazil should give us pause before we embrace it. So popular discourse on racial segregation, desegregation, and integration usually begins from a purely spatial and physical understanding of segregation. We implicitly, and sometimes explicitly, define segregation simply as the separation of distinct racial populations in various spaces and institutions: schools, neighborhoods, workplaces, swimming pools, railways, etc. This particular way of conceiving of segregation is captured in racial demographic maps that look like this. This is where I live. This is Memphis, Tennessee. I apologize if the map is a little bit out of date. It's based on 2010 census data. That's because, like, shortly after 2010, the New York Times created this really cool tool where you could enter any zip code in the country, and based on the census, it would give you a map like this. And unfortunately, they did not update it for 2020, but I can tell you, living in Memphis, this hasn't changed very much. Memphis basically still looks like this. So they're kind of, the green dots represent like concentrations of white people, the brown dots represent concentrations of Black people, and there's a couple other scattered dots in there. There's orange dots are where the Latinos largely live, red dots are where Asians live. But Memphis really is predominantly a biracial city. So you see much more green and blue than any other colors there. And what you see very clearly is that white people live together more or less, and Black people live together more or less. And that particular sort of physical cityscape is very similar to other American cities, right? We find similar patterns of segregation in most American cities. And so this understanding of segregation as a matter of spatial and physical separation is also reflected in the way that we talk about school segregation. So consider this graph that purports to show the fact that Southern schools are resegregating, that they had made some progress toward integration, but somewhere roughly in the 1980s, they started to resegregate. This is based on the same presumption, right? That segregation just means you have white people in one place and Black people in another place. Liberal Supreme Court justices also echo this view of segregation. So this is a quote from Justice Breyer from the 2002 Supreme Court case, Parents versus Seattle, in which he claims to show that Seattle schools were heavily racially segregated. He says, as of 2002, almost 2.4 million students, or over 5% of all public school enrollment, attended schools with a white population of less than 1%. Of these, 2.3 million were Black and Latino students, and only 72,000 were white. Today, more than 1 in 6 Black children attend a school that is 99 to 100% minority. So again, right, segregation in the schools means you have schools where lots of Black children attend, and you have schools where lots of white children attend. And you'll note this is a very biracial model. He talks about Black students being segregated because they're in minority schools, right? He doesn't ask whether those schools might be diverse in other ways. There are no white people, but maybe they could be full of like Latinos and Asians and other races. That's not part of his model at all. He's really only interested in white versus Black. So when we start with this understanding of segregation, right? Segregation is separation in physical space. Then we come to see desegregation simply as the dismantling of that racialized spatial arrangement. So desegregation basically just comes to mean racial mixture, particularly biracial mixture. White people and Black people sharing spaces, sharing institutions, sharing neighborhoods, sharing schools, etc. And in the final step, we often conflate integration and desegregation, such that integration also comes to mean simply spatial proximity. Right? We don't really interrogate like the power dynamics in those spaces. It's just that we see white people and Black people in the same space, it's integrated. This is often the way that we talk about integration in the United States. Now, as integration becomes associated simply with racial mixture in the popular imagination, the ambiguity of the concept of mixture suggests a second meaning, a more literal meaning. And here I'm really speaking about racial miscegenation, interracial love, sex, marriage, and procreation. During Jim Crow, segregation laws and anti-miscegenation laws worked in tandem to erect a wall around whiteness. And white supremacist critics of integration have long charged that it would lead to quote unquote mongrelization and the end of whiteness. Reginald O. writes, racial segregation should be viewed more broadly as a tool of anti-miscegenation. To be clear, he's critical of it, he's not advocating it. Racial segregation should be viewed more broadly as a tool of anti-miscegenation. Just like laws prohibiting interracial marriage, a central purpose of racial segregation was to prevent the development of intimate social relationships between Blacks and whites. Segregationists believed this was necessary to prevent the production of racially mixed children and thus preserve white supremacy and white racial purity. So in response to those anxieties, some defenders of integration openly embrace what O calls the development of intimate social relationships between Blacks and whites. They see these relationships as a potential instrument of racial justice, as a literal embodiment of what Martin Luther King Jr. called the beloved community during the Civil Rights Movement. We find this view articulated, for example, in a recent book by the law professor Cheryl Cashin called Loving, Interracial Intimacy in America and the Threat to White Supremacy. The title of that book is kind of has a clever double meaning. The Supreme Court case that overturned laws banning interracial marriage was called Loving versus Virginia. So the book is about that case and about interracial love more broadly, and Cashin is essentially claiming that these kinds of relationships, the more they proliferate, the more they threaten a white supremacist racial system. So, to sum up, my claim is that our sort of immediate surface view of racial integration is of spatial mixing. And then buried just slightly more deeply in popular consciousness is a view of racial mixture as the view of racial integration as intimate racial mixture. And now I'm going to turn to Brazil and argue that Brazil really shows us why both of those views are problematic, why this is not how we should think about integration, or at least it's not the sum total of how we should think about integration. So let me just begin by noting I'm hardly the first person, hardly the first scholar to try to compare Brazil and the US in terms of their racial politics and racial relations. It's actually a super common theme in the political science literature. And this is because the two countries do appear to offer interesting counterpoints to each other. So both countries were heavily reliant on African slave labor. In fact, Brazil imported more African slaves than any other country or colony in the Americas. In the aftermath of abolition, though, the countries appear to diverge quite strongly from each other. They follow very different paths, it seems. So the US imposes a legal system of racial apartheid in the form of Jim Crow in the South. It defines Blackness, who counts as Black. But if you're going to say that Black people have to ride in the back of the bus, if you're going to say Black children have to attend Black schools, you need to know who actually counts as Black. And state after state after state, beginning with my own state of Tennessee, proceeded to define Blackness as anyone who had any Black ancestry whatsoever. This was popularly known as the one drop of Black blood law. On the other hand, Brazil ultimately comes to embrace racial mixture, or mestiçagem in Portuguese, as one of the defining elements of the Brazilian nation. In place of the rigid black-white binary that we see in the US, right, where anyone who has any Black ancestry is Black, racial categories in Brazil appear far more fluid, with dozens of colloquial terms that indicate kind of various different shades of brownness that are embraced by members of the population as their own racial self-descriptors. Also, in contrast to the US South, Brazil never imposed a comprehensive legal system of segregation. This led many in and outside of Brazil to buy the myth of Brazilian racial democracy. And other Latin American countries had somewhat similar myths about themselves as well, but Brazil was really sort of at the vanguard of this. This was the idea that widespread racial mixture of both cultural and sexual varieties had produced a cheerful, festive brown population without clear racial boundaries, and therefore without the racial animosity and exclusion that marked the US and also South African racial systems. This idea became so popular for a time that in the 1950s, UNESCO actually sponsored a series of studies of racial relations in Brazil, hoping that other countries might learn from Brazil's example. The introduction to by Charles Bagley to the first published collection of these studies sums up the basic idea. He writes, Brazil is renowned in the world for its racial democracy. Throughout its enormous area of a half continent, race prejudice is race prejudice and discrimination are subdued as compared to the situation in many countries. In Brazil, three racial stocks, the American Indian, the Negro, and the Caucasoid, have mingled and mixed to form a society in which racial tensions and conflicts are especially mild, despite the great racial variability of the population. Now, we'll see momentarily that this myth of Brazilian racial democracy starts to obscure extreme forms of racial hierarchy and inequality, and specifically anti-Blackness. But it's important to note first, particularly for the argument I'm ultimately going to make, that this is not entirely a myth. That is to say, the sociologist Edward Telles has persuasively demonstrated, this is just one of his books, he's sort of demonstrated this over the course of many articles and books about Brazil, that Brazil really does exhibit significantly greater degrees of racial intermarriage, miscegenation, and lower degrees of spatial racial segregation in neighborhoods specifically than the US. So that is to say, like, more in Brazil, there are more people from sort of different racial backgrounds forming families, and there are more people from different racial backgrounds living together in the same neighborhoods than in the United States. And indeed, this is kind of reflected just if you go to a major Brazilian city and walk around, you will see sort of festive scenes of interracial conviviality just throughout major Brazilian cities, including small street parties and public squares, going all the way up to Rio de Janeiro's famous carnival celebrations. And this is actually not carnival. This is a picture that I took in May of 2017 in Rio on just a random Monday night. There's a part of town called Pedro do Sal, and every Monday night, I don't know if this is still true after the pandemic, but at least until the pandemic, every Monday night there was free samba in the square in this part of town. And this is what the streets looked like every single Monday night without fail. You had people from the city, people from other parts of Brazil, people from all over the world, and people of every racial background sort of mixing and dancing in the streets. And these kind of images are very common, I think, in the popular imagination of Brazil. Also, for the very first time in the 2016 Brazilian census, and in every census since then, more Brazilians have identified as mixed or brown, pardo, than white or black. So this is from the sort of like Brazilian Census Organization, showing that a majority of Brazilians now identify as mixed or brown, which is to show that kind of Brazilians themselves are rejecting the black-white binary and embracing this idea of mixture as part of their own identity. And all of that is to say that Brazil appears to be far more racially integrated, right, based on the definition I gave previously, than the US. There's greater interracial mixing in both space and in intimate relationships, and people are happy to embrace their own mixed identities. Yet, this kind of integration in Brazil has done little or nothing to achieve gender and racial justice. Quite the contrary, scholars and activists like Michael Hanchard, Abdius do Nascimento, and Sueli Carneiro have made a strong case that the Brazilian myth of racial democracy actively thwarts the pursuit of racial justice. Indeed, the very UNESCO studies that were designed to spread Brazilian racial democracy around the world in the 1950s ended by concluding that there was no such thing as Brazilian racial democracy. The French anthropologist Roger Bastide and the Brazilian sociologist Florentine Fernandes would memorably characterize Brazil's dominant racial ideology as, quote, the prejudice of not having prejudice, a characterization that has been endlessly repeated ever since in studies of Brazilian racial politics. So why did Brazil come to embrace racial mixture while the US plunged into harsher and harsher forms of racial segregation? The main reason is simple demography. As I mentioned earlier, Brazil imported more African slaves than any other country or colony in the Americas, and it also had a very small and kind of sparsely populated Portuguese settler population. That just necessarily produced high degrees of interracial sex and procreation. And so after abolition, Brazil already had a heavily mixed population. And if you think about like 19th century racial ideologies coming from the West, right, scientific racism at the time coming from Europe and from North America, held that racial mixture necessarily led to degeneration and decline. And advanced civilization could only be maintained or achieved by preserving white purity. If that was the case, then Brazil was already doomed in the 19th century. Needless to say, Brazilian intellectuals did not want to accept that conclusion. They did not want to believe that their country was doomed, that it could never join the pantheon of civilized nations. And so early 20th century writers in Brazil, writers like José Batista Lacerda and Oliveira Viana, made a crucial modification to European scientific racism. They introduced the idea of branqueamento, or whitening. Their argument was that miscegenation would produce a gradual whitening of the population rather than degeneration. Now, despite embracing mixture and miscegenation, this theory is obviously still white supremacist and anti-Black. It presents white blood as superior to Black blood, and it views miscegenation as a tool for the eradication of Blackness, right? It's not valuable in itself, it's just that over the course of multiple generations, there won't be any more Black people in Brazil. That was the argument of early 20th century Brazilian intellectuals who initially promoted racial mixture. So whiteness for them remains the mark of civilization and modernity, and Blackness is the mark of atavism and savagery. Now, in 1933, the Brazilian social theorist Gilberto Freire published his best-known book, Casa Grande e Senzalas, translates more or less to the big house and the slave quarters. I should say Gilberto Freire is probably the best-known and most highly regarded social theorist in Brazil. If you go to his hometown, his house is now like a museum that people visit, but he's also extremely contentious. So while he's recognized as super important, he's also highly criticized by a lot of Brazilian intellectuals, and particularly by a lot of Afro-Brazilian intellectuals. Now, his book ostensibly severed the celebration of miscegenation from branqueamento. In other words, he ostensibly celebrated mixture for its own sake, rather than simply as a tool for whitening the population. He supposedly embraced mixture as good in itself. He argued that Brazil had forged a uniquely flexible, harmonious national identity through the mixture of three races and cultures: African, Portuguese, and indigenous. Centuries of biological and cultural mixture, centuries of biological and cultural mixture had combined the best elements of these three different peoples while softening racial animosity. So on Freire's account, mixture simultaneously functions as both cause and evidence of Brazil's lack of racism. And while he never used the term racial democracy himself, his work was quickly embraced by those who wished to paint Brazil as a racial democracy. His book influenced subsequent thinkers and, most importantly, subsequent Brazilian governments to embrace cultural emblems of racial mixture in Brazil, like samba, capoeira, and soccer, as symbols of the Brazilian nation, and to celebrate their ostensible racial harmony on the world stage. Even the military dictatorship saw in racial democracy a way of forging national unity and quelling internal dissent. Yet, of course, not all Brazilians were convinced. In the 1950s, Fernandes found evidence of enduring racial prejudice and racial stratification at all levels of Brazilian society and proclaimed racial democracy a myth. His study prompted numerous other studies on Brazilian racism, and it is now clear beyond a doubt that Brazil was and is a racially stratified society across virtually every possible dimension: economic, sort of residential, where do people live, what kind of housing do they have, environmental, do people live near pollutants, do they live near chemicals that are likely that are toxic, political, what kind of political power do people have, who's likely to hold political power, who gets elected to office. But in every possible way that you could measure racial inequality, Brazil measures as extremely unequal. And not only that, but the way that it is stratified is generally between a sort of narrow population of whites at the top, and then a big population of both Blacks and so-called browns or mixed people at the bottom. So becoming brown or mixed is not an escape hatch from sort of racial subordination in Brazil. Racial justice activists charge that it is difficult to organize Afro-descendant Brazilians to contest that reality. It's hard to get a Brazilian Black movement going at all because the many intermediate brown categories of self-identification preclude the possibility of political solidarity based on shared Blackness. Lots of Brazilians don't want to call themselves Black. This is why they call themselves brown. And they don't want to join a movement for Black equality because that would be to acknowledge their own Blackness. Indeed, assertions of strong Black identities in Brazil are frequently denounced by major intellectuals and politicians as anti-Brazilian, as lamentable attempts to import the racist US system, the one drop of Black blood system, into Brazil. So ultimately, I think that this satirical image from a Brazilian newspaper nicely summarizes the problem with the myth of racial democracy. And so you can see sort of at the very top of the Brazilian socioeconomic and political hierarchy, you have this small group of kind of rich white plutocrats, and they're all saying, yes, there is racial democracy in Brazil. And then as you go further and further down the pyramid, you do end up having a more and more racially mixed population. And they're saying only if you're down here at the bottom. And so yes, there's lots of mixture in the favelas, there's lots of mixture in the slums, there's lots of mixture among poor Brazilians, but not among the sort of rich white class who ultimately have most of the political, economic, and social power in Brazil. Okay, so that's Brazil. Then what does that actually teach us about racial integration here in the United States? Very briefly, there's just 3 basic lessons that I want to go over. First, and most obviously, racial mixture is not the same thing as racial justice or racial equality. Now, to be fair, none of the advocates of integration would say that, right? No one is saying mixture is the same as justice or equality. The trouble, though, is that mixture is often seen as a stepping stone to more transformational policies of racial redress. And Brazil should give us pause before we think that that's true. There's long been in the social sciences, ever since the 1950s, there's this hypothesis called the contact hypothesis, popularized by the social psychologist Gordon Allport, which says that as we bring sort of different populations together, the more that they mix, the more that they interact with each other, the more positive they feel towards each other, and the more sort of they're willing to recognize each other as equals. And my claim here is that Brazil should make us doubt the contact hypothesis, at least in some circumstances. The higher levels of social intimate and spatial mixture in Brazil have not produced a more racially egalitarian society. If anything, they have merely served to obfuscate the stark racial hierarchy that continues to define Brazil. Or to put it differently, in Brazil, racial mixture and racial subordination are 2 sides of the same coin. Second, Brazil's experience with glorified mixture raises questions about whether it is really possible to disentangle mixture from whitening, from branqueamento, in a society that has a long-standing history of white supremacy and anti-Blackness. In Brazil today, Black movement activists argue that they have to struggle even to make Blackness visible, right? Everyone is so intent on defining themselves as brown, on denying that there are real racial distinctions in the population, that Black movement activists feel like Black identity in Brazil is basically disappearing. They have to convince people that they are Black and that they should embrace Black identity. A century of romanticized mixture has encouraged millions of Afro-descendant Brazilians to eschew Blackness and choose intermediate identities instead. Third, and finally, when we synthesize these 2 lessons, we see that racial mixture must be accompanied by serious transformations that pursue social, political, and economic power for Black Americans. In my book, and this is really before I did any of this research in Brazil, but in my book, I argue that we should see those kind of transformations as part of the very meaning of integration, right? That we shouldn't define integration simply as spatial mixture. It's not just the sharing of spaces, it's also the sharing of power, political, economic, and social power. And the problem is that unless, just given the demographics of America, although perhaps this is changing now, we'll see, but without reasonable levels of support from white Americans for those kind of transformations, it's really difficult to see how you could get the project of this vision of integration off the ground. So we might be able to move towards greater mixture, but it's not clear that we can move towards a real redistribution of power. I think part of the obstacle to convincing people that we should see integration this way in the United States is a kind of simplistic and cartoonish public discourse that we have about the 1960s civil rights movements. I think many of us come away from that discourse with the impression that racial integration and Black power are fundamentally antithetical demands. But on the contrary, Martin Luther King Jr. himself saw Black power as constitutive of the very meaning of racial integration. The 2 were I'm just gonna say related to each other, but more than that, Black power is part of integration. He wrote in 1967, just 1 year before he was assassinated in Memphis, where I live, he wrote, "I speak here of integration in both the ethical and the political senses. On the one hand, integration is true intergroup, interpersonal living. On the other hand, it is the mutual sharing of power. I cannot see how the Negro will be totally liberated from the crushing weight of poor education, squalid housing, and economic strangulation until he is integrated with power into every level of American life." So to make good on Dr. King's vision would require a pretty radical transformation of a really broad array of socioeconomic and political institutions and indicators. At a minimum, we would have to close or at least significantly narrow the massive racial wealth gap that presently exists. We would have to provide access to quality housing, schools, and neighborhoods. We would have to reform our political system, probably get rid of the electoral college, among some other things. And we would have to dismantle the system of mass incarceration that Michelle Alexander famously denounced as the new Jim Crow. So finally, I'm going to return to where I began, with pessimism. I do think that this model of integration as the sharing of power rather than just the sharing of space answered a lot of the concerns of many integration critics. But do we have reason to believe that we can actually advance this model of integration in the United States, or for that matter, anywhere in the Americas? Now, I'm not giving a definitive no to that question. I think a lot of past political transformations probably once seemed unimaginable, including the abolition of slavery. So my point is not that this will never happen. My point is only that integration pessimism is a perfectly sensible and reasonable position, especially for Black Americans. In my book, I sort of go through a lot of reasons for this, a lot of evidence why we should be skeptical that anything like this vision of integration is coming anytime soon. But for now, since I need to wrap up, I'm just going to go with the easiest one, right? Donald Trump might be about to become president again. We'll see. And it's probably worth remembering that in 2016, he was elected with the overwhelming support of white Americans. And in fact, like a more fine-grained analysis of these results showed that white support for Trump was consistent across virtually any demographic distinction within white people that you could think of. That is to say, white women voted for Trump, even white college graduates by a very narrow margin in 2016 voted for Trump. So it wasn't just the so-called white working class, right, that like every journalist in America like went to diners in Nebraska to interview. Those were not the only people who voted for Donald Trump. It wasn't just white men. Now, it is true that Biden defeated Trump in 2020, and there was some movement toward Biden amongst white voters. Most notably, white college graduates did prefer Biden to Trump, although not by a very wide margin. And overall, this movement was very small, and white voters still favored Trump by significant margins. And my point is only that Black Americans who look at these polls and at the state of our politics in 2024 have plenty of reasons to be skeptical of integration. Specifically, they have good reason to be skeptical that greater rates of mixture will be accompanied with genuine transformations of racial hierarchy. In the present, I fear that racial integration in the US would replicate some of the worst aspects of Brazilian racial democracy. And in the face of that likelihood, I think it's a perfectly reasonable position for Blacks to prefer majority Black spaces and institutions as a means of preserving Black culture and solidarity, and as a means of shielding themselves from the potential racism of majority white spaces and institutions. Again, I'm not saying that there's an obligation on Black people to avoid white people or anything that strong. I'm not saying that we should reimpose like de jure segregation. Of course not. I'm simply saying as a matter of choice, as a matter of personal preference, those Blacks who prefer Black spaces, that's reasonable. It makes sense. They shouldn't be chastised for that. They shouldn't be seen as political traitors for that, which is basically where I began, what Elizabeth Anderson argues. And so I think that she's wrong to call on Black Americans to abandon Blackness as their primary site of political and cultural allegiance. Ultimately, though, I hope that she won't be wrong forever. I hope that integration with power becomes a more plausible outcome in the future in both the United States and Brazil. So that's what I do. Thank you.
Any questions?
Thank you. I'm just wondering if anyone still talks about integration using that word outside of academia, because I hear a lot about national conversation about diversity, ethnic inclusion. I never hear the word integration in those conversations.
Yeah, so it is true that the word has kind of fallen out of our, I don't know, common public rhetoric. But a lot of academics are arguing that that is precisely part of the problem, that we need to bring that word back. And the complaint, like Elizabeth Anderson's saying that part of the reason we don't talk about integration anymore is because we falsely assume that it was already achieved, that Brown versus the Board of Education and the end of legal segregation meant the arrival of integration. And so we're arguing that we need to put the word sort of back on the national agenda because we never achieved it. And that without the achievement of integration, we can't have racial justice. So you're right that we don't hear that word a lot. There is a push to kind of bring that word back. And I'm somewhat critical of that push, obviously.
Interesting talk. Makes me think in comparison, I wonder if you compare it to South Africa, where Trevor Noah's book Born a Crime is such a radically different thing that's going on there versus Brazil.
So, I can't really speak to South Africa much. I will say, if I could just find the slide again. Just a minute. So, sorry. Yeah, this book here, by Anthony Mars, I think that was 1992, is a three-way comparison between Brazil, the United States, and South Africa. There are scholars who bring South Africa into that comparison and see it as sort of a third case that has some nuances that neither the United States nor Brazil captures. But I'm not, outside of having read that book, I have not read any literature in South Africa, so I will just recommend that book, I guess, and try not to answer the question badly. Sorry.